Sony Computer Entertainment America presents a Universal Interactive Studios production. Created and developed by Naughty Dog, it's Crash Bandicoot Warped. Okay, so I couldn't really think of much of an intro for this one without really referencing that iconic boot-up screen for Crash Bandicoot Warped. Yes, it's time for the third review of Crash Bandicoot, this time tackling the final Naughty Dog platformer for the series. Crash Bandicoot Warped, for many, was their first Crash Bandicoot game, and by far, it's many people's favorite entry in the series. For good reason, too. The gameplay, already refined from Crash 1 and 2, was tweaked ever so slightly once again to bring us some of the best gameplay that Naughty Dog had to offer at the time. For me personally, Crash Bandicoot Warped was a favorite of mine briefly, but it still holds a number 3 slot for me inside of the overall franchise and a number 2 slot in the Naughty Dog Crash Bandicoot game rankings for sure. Funny enough, I never played this game at my cousin's house, unlike Crash Bandicoots 2 and Racing, as he actually never owned this game. I wouldn't play Crash Bandicoot Warped until around 2002, when it would be the first Crash Bandicoot game I ever officially owned. I think the only reason I was actually able to get Warped rather easily when compared to Crash Bandicoot 2 was since that there were so many copies of Warped out there. I have plenty of memories of replaying the first Warp Room since I didn't have too big of a memory card and didn't want to part with certain saves on it yet. But I could ramble all day about the inadequate amount of memory I had with consoles when it came for memory cards. For now, let's get into a bit of Crash Bandicoot Warped. Once again, Crash Bandicoot Warped was the brainchild of Naughty Dog and published by Universal Interactive Studios just 1 year after the launch of Crash Bandicoot 2: Cortex Strikes Back. By this point, Crash Bandicoot Mania was at an all-time high, and this would positively affect Warped with how well it sold. Receiving overwhelmingly positive reviews and selling over 6 million copies to make it one of the best-selling PlayStation 1 games of all time. Warped's quality cannot be understated. But for me, why does it edge out only third in the series overall? Well, let's explore some of the gameplay tweaks and additions, as I believe that will illustrate my point rather well. Gameplay-wise, Crash Bandicoot Warped controls perfectly, just about as tightly as the second game, only with a little bit more, I want to say, weight to it. Warped refines the little nitpicks of 2 that I feel were very big problems in the first game, and that really makes it jarring to go from Crash Bandicoot Warped back to the first game. In terms of small improvements though, Crash no longer can walk off or fall off platforms that are teleporting him to another part of the stage. This is an issue I didn't address in the last review because I didn't really find it too big of a deal, but I guess enough people must have fallen off moving platforms that were taking them to a death route or something for Naughty Dog to decide, hey, let's put an invisible wall so that people don't accidentally walk off of it. It's a welcome change, though, overall, and would be something that other Crash Bandicoot games would end up adopting as part of its core gameplay. Another major improvement comes from the addition of a box tally that can be accessed anytime with the triangle button, and a box tally specifically for the bonus stages, so no more cold hard Crash nonsense like before. Third, native analog support was added for Crash Bandicoot Warped. But if one did not have a DualShock controller, they could still use the D-pad like in previous games, as Crash Bandicoot Warped, unlike Ape Escape 1, does not require a DualShock analog controller. Last, bosses are much easier to refight, as a button in the Warp Room allows you to fight the boss and is easily present, as opposed to Crash Bandicoot 2 requiring the player to hit the triangle button when moving Warp Room to Warp Room in order to refight the boss. Bosses this time around take the same page from Crash Bandicoot 2's playbook, where most are returning bosses, but with all new fights. There are new antagonists added into Crash Bandicoot Warped, and it is a treat to be sure. This time, I enjoy all but one of the bosses, that boss being Tiny Tiger's fight due to it not really being that interesting when compared to his Crash Bandicoot 2 introduction, and it just being an overall easy fight. Then again, it is only the first fight in the game, so that is to be expected. All of them have unique challenges to make them difficult in some way, shape, or form, except for Tiny, where you can cheese the entire fight. Added into Warp as well are abilities granted to Crash upon defeating the boss of a Warp Room. From the useful double jump, death tornado spin, Wumpa Bazooka, or Wumpuka as I call it, and original premiere of the Speed Shoes to the highly situational and rarely ever used Super Belly Flop. While some may be situational, all the power-ups can change Crash or Coco's meaning of play. Yes, I mentioned Coco, but not until the Insane Trilogy was Coco really playable in other levels in Warped. Although she still isn't playable in some of the levels, unfortunately, even in the Insane Trilogy. The Insane Trilogy connects with Crash 1 and 2 for allowing Coco to be playable there thanks to the time travel element in 3, which is a nice little continuity touch that they added in, I will admit. But in classic Crash 3, Coco is only playable in 3 types of levels. Jet ski traveling levels, these control worse in the Insane Trilogy by the way. Ancient Chinese levels during the Great Wall of China's construction where she rides a tiger named Pura. And finally, airplane level. She probably has the best boss in the game as well with the fight against Dr. Engine's new robot. But unless you're playing Insane Trilogy's Warp, then that's all the action Coco really gets in the game, unfortunately. Crash, on the other hand, not only has platforming this time, but can ride a motorcycle, deep dive in the ocean, ride a dinosaur across platforms, and fly a plane around like Coco. I will say this now. I love when Crash Bandicoot remembers it's a platformer first and foremost, and a vehicle simulator second. While the levels are fun for the first time, some of the tropes get 2 or 3 renditions of the same type, and trust me when I say that motorcycle races do get annoying after a while. The platforming levels of Crash 3 are excellent. Some of the best designed ones in the entire franchise, to be sure. But a good third of the game are bogged down by vehicle sections if I'm being generous. There was an extra exceedingly difficult level added into the Insane Trilogy's version of Warped made by Vicarious Visions known as Future Tense, which contains 2 gems and a relic, making the total percentage of Crash 3 108% instead of 105. This level, marking the first absolutely new Crash Bandicoot content since Mind Over Mutant, was free to download and is now bundled alongside of Crash 1's Stormy Ascent in all versions of the Insane Trilogy if you were to buy a new copy now. But back into the levels in the original base game. So yes, Crash Bandicoot Warp does have a lot of vehicle levels. These vehicle levels making up around a little bit less than half, if not half, of the total Warp Room level counts, including the 2 bonus levels that are added to make for a total of 32 levels in Crash Bandicoot Warped overall. The problem, though, is that some of the levels are simply alternate routes in the previous levels to get a possible returning gem or 2, while the others are said vehicle levels. Crash Bandicoot Warped, once again, adds 5 main warp rooms with a secret 6th warp room accessed by collecting Time Relic. For every 5 Time Relics you collect in a stage, a new 6th warp room level is unlocked. Collect all the Time Relics with a gold ranking from the Time Trials, and Coco will award the player with a secret 45th gem, raising the total percentage of Crash Bandicoot Classic to 105%, and allowing the player to get the true ending to Crash Bandicoot Warped. But what is the story for Crash Bandicoot Warped? And is it worth getting the secret 105% ending? Well, in the past, it really wasn't, because it wasn't referenced in any other games, but I guess we can get into the story of Crash Bandicoot Warped right now. Crash Bandicoot Warped story begins with the 100% ending of Crash Bandicoot 2 Cortex Strikes Back. After the Cortex Vortex was destroyed by Crash and company, a piece falls to Insanity Island and proceeds to collide with an ancient temple. This temple housed the imprisoned mask Uka Uka, the twin brother of our mask Aku Aku, who has been assisting Crash within the previous games. Uka Uka was upset that Cortex had failed to follow his instructions to conquer the world, and not only had he lost all the crystals, but all the gems as well, resulting in there being no power left to conquer the planet. Since Cortex's failure had set Uka Uka free, he would spare Cortex and use him to help Dr. Nefarious Tropy gather the crystals and gems in different time periods so that they can amass the power needed to enslave the Earth. Aku Aku, not wanting his brother to succeed, brings Crash and Coco to the device Cortex and Co. plan to use to gather the crystals, the Time Twister machine, so that they can gather the crystals and gems instead before Uka Uka and Cortex are able to gather them first. And that's the basic plot of Crash Bandicoot Warped. Gather crystals again, But the time travel motif will take the player from the Middle Ages to the Jurassic period, future, and in between to make for some remarkably interesting level designs and locales. As for the 105% ending, well, thanks to the existence of Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time, that ending is now canon to the series entirely, with Crash 4 picking up after the events of Crash Bandicoot Warp's 105% ending. For the longest time, this 105% ending was never really canon to the story, as Wrath of Cortex and all other games before Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time, never even reference it at all. Warp's story is a good middle ground between Crash 2 and Crash 1, where it's a simple plot but has depth to it as well. Uka Uka as a new antagonist is extremely menacing and overshadows Cortex in every way to give that Cortex has basically been demoted as of Warp due to his failures of dealing with Crash. Dr. Entropy is also an interesting character, but is not really explored as anything more than a lackey of Uka Uka, which luckily Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time actually flushes him out, but more on that later. Aku Aku receiving more character as well would lay the groundwork for the future of the series, with most plots of future games until Crash Bandicoot 4 revolving around something with Aku Aku and Uka Uka in some way. Really, it would not be until the Mutant game series, and the very last Mutant game at that, where Cortex would retake control as the main villain moniker of being an actual threatening villain. In the end though, Crash Bandicoot Warped Story gets a good grade from me for how entertaining and concise it is with its time travel plot, which is something that many games and movies can easily mess up. But part of the reason it works is because and thanks to the stellar voice work done in Warped, and the sound design coming together to show different aspects of the game altogether. Voice work in Warped once again comes down to the amazing performances by actors and characters. Clancy Brown returns once more to give a stellar, but less threatening Cortex, and also comes in to voice in the new and highly intimidating Uka Uka. Brendan O'Brien, on the other hand, returns to voice previous characters such as N-Gin, Crash, and provides the voice for Tiny Tiger, who now actually has a voice. While Entropy, on the other hand, is voiced by the talented Michael Ensign, with new villain Dingo Dial being voiced by the talented William Hootkins. Finally, there is Mel Winkler to provide the voice of Aku Aku, and Winkler would provide the voice of Aku Aku well until the Mutant games, where he would be replaced with Greg Eagles. For the Insane Trilogy's version of Crash Bandicoot Warped, the cast remains largely the same from Crash 2, with Jess Harnell voicing Crash, Lex Lang voicing Cortex, Corey Burton voicing N-Gin and Dr. Entropy, and with new voices such as Fred Tatascore as Dingo Dial and John DiMaggio as Tiny Tiger and Uka Uka, with again Greg Eagles returning as Aku Aku. Now, you might have noticed that I haven't mentioned Coco yet. Well, Coco actually didn't speak and does not speak at all in Crash Bandicoot Warped. In both the classic and Insane Trilogy versions of the game, Coco has no lines of dialogue at all, but does have some sound effects in the Insane Trilogy provided by Debbie Derryberry. Since Coco is not voiced in Warped, it's kind of strange seeing as how she was kind of a main character in the last game, but in this game she's just sort of there. Although with the ability of her tinkering with the time twister machine in the background, it's always really interesting to see that and infer certain things. Not to mention the fact that apparently in the Japanese version of Crash Bandicoot Warped, Coco actually did have a voice, and I can't confirm or deny it because I've not played the Japanese version of Crash Bandicoot Warped. But there is a credit inside of the Japanese version for Coco having a voice actress. So take that as you will. Musically, the soundtrack of Warped is just as great as Crash Bandicoot 1 and 2 thanks to the returning composer Josh Mansell. Mansell has even released pre-console versions of these tracks over the years, which all sound amazing. And I'm honestly surprised that they have not used any of these tracks for anything else or didn't use them in the Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy. The boss themes of Crash Bandicoot Warped go hard in as being amazing. I love every single one of them, especially the bombastic final battle with Cortex and Uka Uka and Dr. Entropy's theme. The main title theme as well and the Warp Room theme of Crash Bandicoot Warped would also go on to be considered a sort of unofficial main theme for Crash Bandicoot for decades, being referenced in other Crash Bandicoot games, if not outright used entirely. In the end, if you expected things to get worse for voiceover and music in between games, then you'd be sorely mistaken. In the end, Crash Bandicoot Warped marks a good send-off for the Naughty Dog games with the orange marsupials. Sure, there was one more Crash Bandicoot game, Crash Team Racing, but that one wasn't a platformer with an overarching story like the classic trilogy was. The gameplay in Crash Bandicoot Warped is highly refined and still works even to this day. The music and voices have aged tremendously as well, which cannot be said for a lot of PlayStation 1 games, to say the least. Heck, this was the end of Naughty Dog's role in platformers for Crash, but they made their mark on the PlayStation, and Crash would be remembered fondly by many for decades. But we're not done with this Crash Bandicoot mini marathon yet, folks. For the next review, and that is going to be not Crash Bandicoot The Wrath of Cortex or Crash Team Racing. No. It's time we look and see how the franchise has been soft rebooted with the latest entry in the series, Crash Bandicoot 4. It's about time. So anyway, everyone, I'm gonna end it off right here. This has been Neronium, and I'll see you all next time.